Ferry Building has stood on the water's edge of Market Street since nearly the Civil War era. Before the opening of the Bay Bridge, the Ferry Building wasn't just an iconic landmark, but also the literal front door into the heart of San Francisco. Now, over 100 years later, it stands not only in the present day, but also as a reminder of a city and era gone by. As we're biking toward the Ferry Building down Market Street, let's take this tour back in time to over 100 years ago. This restored footage was taken just 4 days before the great 1906 earthquake, during which the Ferry Building clock famously stopped at 5:16 a.m., freezing that moment of disaster in time. If we fast forward less than a decade to 1913, San Francisco will have rebuilt from the rubble, with 60,000 commuters crossing the bay twice each workday. These workers exited the Ferry Building into a barely controlled chaos of streetcars, horses, cable cars, and railroads. By 1930, this transit system handled more people than any hub in the world, except London's Charing Cross station. The following quote by an anonymous author describes the atmosphere.
The smells of copra, of oakum, raw sugar, roasting coffee, and rotting piles in mud and salt water creep up the darkened streets. Even before the 8 o'clock wail of the Ferry Building siren, the Embarcadero comes violently to life. From side streets, great trucks roll through the yawning doors of the piers. The longshoremen, clustered in groups before the pier gates, swarm up ladders and across gangplanks.
Yosemite beer is advertised in stained art glass at 5 cents a glass. The owner is confident that beer won't cost more in his lifetime. San Francisco's waterfront is a working man's hangout, belonging to the men who went down to the sea in ships. A 91-year-old sea captain named Fred, who first sailed into San Francisco in 1909, recalled the old days in the city front.
If you walked into a saloon and called captain, half the men in the place would look up.
As a broke young sailor, he relied on one of San Francisco's great saloon traditions, the free lunch.
If it wasn't for the free lunch, many workers wouldn't have survived. At Sanguinetti's, you could get a scoop of steamed beer, some spaghetti, and Italian bread, and all the fish you could eat for a nickel.
Even if the working man made up the heart of the city during this time, they didn't call the shots. Greedy big business interests controlled the waterfront where the longshoremen worked until they successfully unionized in 1934. By July, tensions came to a breaking point when police fired into a crowd of strikers, with over 75 men shot, clubbed, or hit by tear gas canisters in what would become known as Bloody Thursday. Following that day, almost all the longshoremen's demands were met in one of the greatest triumphs for organized labor in U.S. history. Ironically, vast changes heading for San Francisco would soon make their victory irrelevant. Thanks to bridges, automobiles, and an increase in container shipping, in just 24 years, the Ferry Building would go from being the main artery of San Francisco to a vestige of a bygone era. But as they say, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. And with the death of working ports following World War II, women started pouring into the city. The middle class also grew enormously, allowing for bohemian movements like the Beats and the Hippies to arrive in San Francisco. With the city changing and new socioeconomic groups pouring in, it's only fitting that a group of middle-class women would be responsible to start a movement that helped preserve the bay surrounding the Ferry Building into present times. I've spent a lot of time talking about the Ferry Building as the center of San Francisco's famous working port, with San Francisco Bay being a perfect natural harbor. However, San Francisco Bay is not just a harbor, it's perhaps more importantly a unique and essential ecosystem, supporting over 500 different species of fish, birds, mammals, amphibians, and invertebrates. But until the 60s, that didn't mean a lot to the people living off of it. Factories, manufacturers, and farmers all poured waste directly into the bay, and raw, unfiltered sewage was dumped in as well. The bay was also being filled in and shrinking at an alarming rate. There was no public outcry over any of this because the public didn't really know. Almost all the tidelands were privately owned. It wasn't until a planner conducting a survey realized there were extensive plans to fill in remaining portions of the bay, and with no community input, that 3 activists started calling for protection of natural resources. Those activists were Sylvia McLaughlin, Kay Kerr, and Esther Gulick. Starting their own organization called Save the Bay, they used mailing lists from the Sierra Club and other groups to send out hundreds of letters calling attention to the destruction of the bay and asking for donations. The response was overwhelming. Public contributions poured in, and the media and politicians came on board. As a result, in 1965, the first coastal zone management agency in the world was created to protect the bay. Today, the Ferry Building is no longer the heart of a working man's city or a gateway into SF. And fortunately, it's not an industrial landfill blighting out nature either. Instead, it's a place where tourists and locals alike can come for the weekly farmers markets, flea markets, shopping, and restaurants, or just to take a minute to look out at the bay and to maybe find an appreciation for and connection to the past.